Okay, so like me, I expect that all of you write code. What I'd like to know just to start with is who also sometimes writes documentation. So put your hand up if you ever write documentation. Okay, quite a few people, but here's the next one. Keep your hand up if you like it. Not many hands left, and that is in a way the crux of the problem. I'm Peter Hilton. I'm not really going to introduce myself other than to say I have a website and everything's on there. Or follow me on Twitter. The documentation problem is, I think, well-known and universal. So I want to first help us understand what is the problem, why is this a problem, and in particular, what causes the documentation problem. In my experience, number one cause is this, not literally, but these are M&Ms, right? But M&Ms in the documentation problem are managers and meetings. Managers and meetings want documentation. They want you to give them tangible things, because if you give them software, they don't really know what to do with that. Meetings also are sort of this, they are failure demands. They are a request for information that wasn't satisfied by just logging into some software. Failure demand is something worth Googling, but it's another topic. So demand for documentation from other people who are not programmers is one of the key causes. Let's try something else. Sometimes you join a project, you join a team, and this happens. I mean, not literally, you don't find yourself in the middle of Chinatown, but you find yourself among lots of code, and you just can't understand any of it. So what I'm talking about here is an unfamiliar problem domain. You start working in an industry that you don't know anything about. It's suddenly your tax consultancy or it's supply chain. Subject matter domains can be complicated and have their own language that it takes you some time to learn. So the language of projects and the language of code is often a cause for needing documentation. I want to show you another example, another cause. So as I'm sure all of you know, these are fragments of the second book of the Iliad. This is written in Greek uncial script, dated to the 2nd century. So as code goes, this is quite old code. And it was maybe at the time, this was quite readable. People knew what to do with this. But I mean, this is really old code. It's so old that there are no spaces between words. I mean, how can you even argue about spaces versus tabs when spaces haven't been invented yet? Right, this is problems. So if we want to work with this code today, we're going to need to kind of update it. We're going to need to have some documentation. And so here's a slightly more modern version of the same code. And and it's still good stuff, but it needs some explanation because we're not so familiar now with what was the context at the time. And so when we're talking about code, we have a particular name for this situation. And so, frankly, this is now legacy poetry. It's good stuff, you don't throw it away. And so legacy code needs documentation, just because you have to explain the context as it was at the time. Legacy code is often something that doesn't have the documentation it needs. So if any of you are fans of classic programmer paintings, you may recognize this, this painting by Jean-François Millet, who painted this scene in rural France of software developers trying to find the documentation, because often it's not there. And that's a painful situation to be in. You've got thousands or 100,000 lines of somebody else's legacy code, and you're trying to figure it out. And it's important, otherwise you would have thrown it away. It has business value, otherwise you wouldn't still be running it in production. But figuring it out can be difficult. So why does this happen? Well, clever chap called Rob Smallshire has done some fancy modeling and worked out that if you work on a team that numbers 10 developers, you can expect half of them, 5, to leave at some point in the next 3.1 years. So what he's saying is that the half-life of members of your development team is 3.1 years. Your team decays, it gets smaller. So that's kind of normal. I mean, people move on, change jobs. The problem is that the half-life of, for example, code, lines of code, is longer. So if you have 100,000 lines of code, it takes 13 years to get rid of even half of them. What this means is that after some years on a project, most of the code is written by people who are no longer there. That's how legacy code happens. It's inevitable. So these are just some examples of different causes of the documentation problem. It's nobody's fault particularly, but it's true, it's a thing. And also, we're not hugely enthusiastic as programmers about fixing this by writing lots of documentation. This is not our favorite solution. So let's switch to my favorite solution, which is not writing documentation. I'm sure this is why you're all here. And the good news is that you can avoid writing documentation. Docs, I'll call it docs because it doesn't fit on the slide otherwise. I hope that's okay. And the good news is that there are constructive ways to avoid writing documentation. But before you start looking at, how we're going to avoid documentation, I think it is useful to just consider how committed are you to avoiding documentation? How far will you go? Because some of the ways to avoid documentation may seem worse. For example, you don't have to write any documentation at all if every time you create a class or whatever, at the top of the file, in the comment, you put your mobile phone number because you can be on call for the rest of your life. And then you don't need to write anything down. They'll just phone you up. I mean, you may have changed jobs by then. So what we're looking for is alternatives that work. This works, but we're also looking for alternatives that are more constructive and perhaps less painful in practice. So I'm talking about constructive laziness. Constructive laziness is the art of turning boring work into a programming problem and getting away with it. The idea that you solve things by writing code. It's not a new idea. I first came across it in The Cathedral and the Bazaar, essay from the 90s by Eric Raymond. And this book, Programming Perl, introduces the virtue of programmer laziness. And that's even older. And so my first idea today is the idea that you can apply constructive laziness to the problem of software documentation. That is documentation avoidance. It's constructive laziness. Now, we start with some non-technical ideas because it's a people thing. I mean, documentation is about communication, even more so than code is. But code is communication too. So, for example, in this British comedy series, British television, The IT Crowd, which I highly recommend if you haven't seen it, Roy is showing us the same commitment to his standard of IT support. He's showing the same commitment to software documentation. What he's doing here is he's doing just-in-time documentation. So the way this works, and this is a practical technique that you can apply in the office, is you don't write documentation. And when people come and ask you for the documentation, you just say it's on the wiki. And most of the time, they'll go away, right? And so this is achievement number one. They go away. You continue to write code. The next step is that you just continue to write code. Because half the time, they don't even ever come back. They just figure it out by themselves. Sometimes they do come back. So you're going to need to pretend that you thought it was on the wiki, but maybe it's not. I'll look for it, right? So tell them you'll look for the documentation, and then go and write the documentation, right? So only if somebody asks twice. And then you see them at lunchtime, you say, oh, I found that documentation you were looking for, I'll send you a link. This works pretty well, because not only do you get to cheat by hoping somebody else will go away and figure it out by themselves, which they do sometimes. They were just coming to you because they were lonely or something. But also, it avoids writing documentation that nobody needs. I mean, this is how you follow demand. You wait until the moment that somebody asks for the second time. They must really want it at this stage. And so what you're doing is you're writing documentation that's going to be valuable. But in terms of documentation avoidance, you're focusing on not writing it. So this is an improvement. This will reduce the amount of documentation you have to write. Here's another technique. Another technique is to, an alternative to writing things down, is to stop coding and to patiently explain things, to talk to each other. This person is patiently explaining software to the other person, but this isn't really real. So I don't think he's actually a programmer, and this is stock photography, let's face it. So the trick in here is to not be that person. So you want people to explain the documentation, but you just don't need it to be you. So this is then the more advanced version of just-in-time documentation, which is reverse just-in-time documentation. I have a colleague who I work with at the moment, and we work remotely, and we interact a lot on Skype or Team Chat. And I'm working with a code base where he wrote a lot of the original code, and he didn't write any comments, and some of it's harder to understand. So when I'm looking at this code and I'm thinking, I could do with some documentation here, I call him up on Skype and I say, I'm having trouble working out what this class is for. Could you just tell me? So he tells me, and while he talks, I type. And he dictates the documentation to me when I need it. So this is reverse documentation where not only is it just in time as late as possible, but I don't even have to come up with it. I just type it down. And I do want to type it because I'm going to forget this the next day. So ask other people to write the documentation, but ask it in a format that doesn't look like documentation and copy-paste. This is great. It's not like traditional documentation, and they don't know they're doing it, and somebody else is doing it. So these are key elements of documentation avoidance. Now, I want to return back to another special case of documentation problem, documentation demand, which is when you have handover. Somebody's going to leave the team. And what do you do about that? So your project manager comes and says, well, that's okay. This person will just write everything down before they leave. This sounds like an excellent plan, except for the fact it never, ever works. Particularly because this person never wrote the documentation already. I mean, if somebody's worked with you for a few years and they're leaving in 1 month, it's too late. It's just too late for documentation to be the thing. So you need to switch to a non-documentation tactic. Instead, when you need somebody to do handover because they're leaving the team, use pair programming. Pair programming is much more effective than writing documentation when you have the fixed time limit. It's kind of hard on the person who's going to leave, especially if you sort of handcuff them to the desk and make them pair program for 8 hours a day. I mean, that's really hard work. But it's going to be more effective than writing documentation. And the great thing about pair programming is that pair programming is programming, and it's not documentation. So that makes it absolutely better than writing documentation. So pair programming is your next technique. Okay, if there are any user interface designers in the room, you need to look away for this next slide. You don't want to see this, because once you've seen this, it cannot be unseen. Now, user interfaces can be bad. And this particular user interface is what happens when you let a command line programmer design a user interface in Windows. I try to look at this, and I just have to look away. So I'm not entirely sure what it is. I think it might be a user interface for grep or something, which has that many options, so that kind of fits. Anyway, so what I'm showing you here is what happens when you get the wrong person to design the user interface for your software. Now, I think we're pretty used to the idea that if you've got a team of programmers, you shouldn't expect all of them to be good user interface designers. That turns out to not work. This happens. There was probably just one person working on this software, and they turn out to not be a user interface designer. So that's not controversial. It's not controversial, the idea that not everybody is going to be good at expressing themselves in writing, in documentation. This is a good time to quote Kevlin Henney, who's much wittier. If you've got code that needs explaining for whatever reason, getting the person who wrote the code to do the explanation is not necessarily going to fix the problem. So look for something else. Look for the idea that maybe writing documentation is a specialist skill. And so in the same way that when you have half a dozen coders on your team, you don't expect all of you to do the user interface. Maybe you shouldn't expect everybody to do the documentation. I think this is a reasonable argument. This is an argument you can make to your team leader, your manager, to yourself if you're that person. And crucially, this is another reason for getting somebody else to write the documentation. Unless, of course, you are that person. So that's a possibility. Or hire a technical writer. So it turns out that there are people called technical writers who like it. They like writing documentation. Maybe you want some of those. That could be a good thing. Right, deep breath. It's now time for kittens. I had to get out of the way to warm you up for some code about kittens. it's time for code. So I've talked a bit, and I haven't shown you any code yet, and code's kind of important. So here are some examples of code comments. Now, it turns out that code comments are the most hated form of documentation among programmers. I'm not entirely sure why this is, but I think this is because when you're writing code, you can ignore all of the other kinds of documentation, but it's harder to ignore the comments because they are there in your face, looking at you. But a lot of the time, you can get rid of the comments. So that's what we want to do with comments. We want to get rid of them. The way to get rid of comments is to write better code. So to take the first example, I guess this is Java code. We have a method that needs this comment that explains what it does. And the problem is the method name. Get is not a very useful word in a method name. It's a bit too vague. And so we have to add a comment to say that there's calculation going on. So you can fix that simply by renaming the method, and then the comment goes away. I mean, I know naming's hard, but it's, you know, if you can tackle naming, then you might be able to reduce the commenting. The next example, the comment is explaining the return value. Well, if you're fortunate enough to be using a language with types, rather than a language where everything is a string, then you can have a type for that, and then you don't need the comment. So these are refactorings that get rid of the comment. This happens a lot in code. This is even a simplified version of a complex Boolean expression. And if you name the Boolean expression, then you can skip the need for the comment. It makes the code more expressive, if you like. And the final example is simply something that you don't need to ever do because we have version control to tell you who wrote the code. So please don't do this. I mean, it's nice to see, well, I mean, you could do this. You could put my name in your code, but that might make me happy. But don't put people's names in code in general. It's not the thing to do. Here's another bit of code that has a different kind of example. We have some function that's going to do more kitten cuteness calculation, which is the example I chose. And we have a bunch of comments explaining how this works. So this is like comments that define an API. Now, there are two reactions to these kinds of comments. Half of you, I'm going to say it's the left half, are thinking that these should all be tests. You can replace all of these comments with automated tests, and you're right. The other half, you're thinking, no, no, no. If we had a better programming language, we could encode all of this in the code, and you'd be right as well. You're both right. There's two ways to get rid of these kind of comments, and just pick one and do it. So to summarize, documentation avoidance, you have a bunch of techniques. Constructive laziness is the core idea. This leads you to things like just-in-time documentation and deflecting the work to somebody else. Also, turn the work into programming, and pair programming is the best way to do that. But also, refactoring code is also a very satisfying way to avoid documentation, or especially get rid of the documentation. And so sometimes you can respond to demands for documentation by just improving the code. So do that if you can. And in particular, I'd just like to mention again, type-safe programming is an excellent way to improve code so that it needs less documentation, as are tests. So some combination of type-safe programming and tests, you're going to need a lot less documentation. But of course, here's the time for the bad news. You need less, but you still need some. And so you're not always going to get away with documentation avoidance. Because documentation avoidance doesn't always work. So let's suppose you've got a lot of code that's really good, and somebody's asking you for documentation. What do? Maybe you say, read the code. Well, who knows what War and Peace is about? I mean, I have no idea. I haven't read this book. I'm definitely not going to read this book, because it's clearly way too long. Who's got the time? I've got code to write. But the thing is, when code can be self-documenting by being clean code, in the same way that War and Peace is self-documenting by being well-written. I gather that it's well-written. And so, how would you feel if somebody said to you, you should read this book, it's great? And you say, well, what's it about? And they say, oh no, it's self-documenting. Just read the code. That doesn't really work. It would take you weeks. And so what you need in both cases is you need some kind of summary. You need some kind of introduction to the code. And so this is one of the kinds of documentation that code is probably going to need as well. So if you're going to have to write some documentation, start with a short introduction. What the introduction can do is can explain things that are not clear from the code, like what is the purpose of this code? What does it do in broad terms? How much of it is there? And what is the summary of its, let's say, its functionality? You can do the same thing for non-functional qualities, which are the design documentation. Simple documentation is necessary if you don't have time to delve into everything in detail. Ultimately, that might take you years, because 100,000 lines of code is probably even more than War and Peace. I'm not sure, but that happens. And to emphasize an example of one of these, purpose. So let's suppose you're in London walking down the street and you see this. There's something quite disturbing going on here. Why are they not the same color? And you see this in code. You see two things and they're different. And they're different for no apparent reason. Why? Is it important? Is there some crucial requirement that is met by having two different colors? Or is this just because one of them hasn't been repainted yet? Is there perhaps some kind of boundary between the two, and on one side of the boundary they're black and on the other side they're red? This kind of thing needs explanation. And in code, no matter how good the code is, it cannot explain why. And it definitely can't explain why it exists in the first place. So you don't need to write much documentation, but you are unlikely to get away with having people understand why. In fact, this idea that you should explain why, even if you explain nothing else, is apparently worth a whole management book. So it's not just a coding thing, or unless this book is actually about coding. Yeah, I'm going to take that back. This book is obviously a book about programming that explains that you should start your code with an explanation of why. Let's go with that. So this is part of compromising a little bit. Compromising on documentation avoidance by writing a little bit so that you address the documentation need, so that you address the documentation demand, but hopefully with as little time wasted as possible. And when I say time wasted, I mean time not spent coding. So I want to delve further into that idea of ways of documenting code that don't feel like writing documentation. There's more than one kind. I mean, there's lots of different ways that you can document code, and many of them don't include using a word processor to write too many pages of something that you'll print out, put on the shelf, and then never read. And so more code is obviously the best one, such as tests, because then the documenting the code is coding. But we use diagrams. Some things are worth drawing. But we use lots of other tools where we write, especially if you have remote colleagues. And remote doesn't necessarily mean in another country. It just means in the next room, and it's worth using a chat room. And if you're writing stuff, you're probably answering questions, and that is documentation. Work out how to capture that. Also, we may hate writing comments, but we might write commit messages, in our source code control system. So we do write text. The trick is to keep it close to the code that it explains. So code comments are as close to the code as you can get because they're in the code. But it's difficult to talk about comments because it's a touchy subject among developers. If I ever suggest to people that they should write comments, they give me this very strange look. I'm obviously crazy. Well, okay, I might be crazy, but about coding, at least. But comments are universal. I mean, every reasonable programming language lets you write comments. And the thing is, they're just another way to write documentation. But there are others. So let's take the idea that you just don't like comments and you're going to use something else. Another popular idea is that you document the code by documenting the changes to the code, and that your commit messages in your source code control system are not just a few words, but it might be a whole page. So this is from somebody else's blog post explaining how you should write a git commit message. And so it's not just the title. I mean, this starts with a title, but it's got paragraphs of text. It's got bullet points. Now, I'm pretty sure if you do this, you don't write any comments. But if you say, comments are ridiculous, and then you do this, you are kind of writing comments, just in a different place. You probably want tooling to make that easy to work with. But the idea is kind of the same. You know, you have an introduction, you have some explanation, but you're describing changes rather than the static state. I mean, this is kind of like event sourcing for documentation, I guess. And event sourcing is cool, so this is probably cool. Another technique that struck me as pretty useful is README-driven development. This comes from a blog post from a few years ago, but actually we see this a lot in open source projects. We see a small or a new open source project whose only documentation is the README on its GitHub repository that explains. And this is actually a brilliant approach to documentation, because if you go back far enough in IT history, the convention was to write hundreds of pages of documentation, especially on commercial enterprise software projects. And this was definitely too much. But when the reaction to that was to write no documentation at all, we all suffered the pain of finding some wonderful sounding open source project that has no documentation and just deep pain on trying to get it to do anything at all. And so the README is kind of the middle ground. And in particular, what goes in the README, it's the introduction to the project. It's the introduction to the code. So I mentioned that earlier. So the important takeaway from this idea is that it's talking about finding a middle ground, just a compromise. But it doesn't mean middle as in halfway between too much and none. It means hardly any at all. It means a tiny amount of documentation is a much better choice than too much or none. Another technique I discovered when I started looking for other ways people were documenting their code was what seems to be called a DIL, a short article that's completely independent, a little snippet of documentation that you collect together in a GitHub repository. And this kind of works. This is a consequence of simplifying technology, using things like Markdown, which are easier to use, taking advantage of the fact that in GitHub, if you publish, you don't publish as such, you just commit Markdown files to a Git repo, but then it renders them. You click this and you see the rendered version of the documentation. This is great. This is way less effort than most kinds of documentation. And writing this kind of thing isn't a lot of effort. Writing this kind of thing is often quite worthwhile for yourself, because your future self will thank you for answering the question. And there are more kinds of documentation. And so now I've sort of shown a whole screen full of text. So I might as well confess that I do like the idea of actually writing even more sometimes. But not documentation as we know it, but the things that you'd rather have for that open source project that you started using. You don't need the advanced stuff. You'll figure that out by reading the code in the future, if you ever stick with it. What you need is on day one is a tutorial, so you can decide whether you're going to invest the effort, invest the time of reading the code of this thing. So tutorials are a very powerful kind of documentation because they have the most value. Everybody needs the tutorial. The advanced stuff, most people won't need that particular thing. So tutorials have a lot of value. And if you write tutorials, you can be very specific in an interesting way. So not even, if you're using this open source project with that other open source project, with that database, maybe very few people are doing that combination. And very few people have exactly the same problem you got stuck on. So nobody wrote a blog post about this. There's no tutorial online. And if you publish tutorials on your unique combination of technologies in your stack, you might find out that you're instantly top page view on Google searches for this stuff. And you become famous, which is probably worthwhile, I guess. So publishing externally is another way to get more value from documentation. So another way you magnify, so as well as magnifying the benefit of documentation by making it smaller and less effort to write, you can also magnify its value by having more people read it. So just don't write documentation for the 5 people in your team. Write documentation for everybody else as well. make as much as possible public. Here's a particular example I wanted to show because people often ask, what was an example of sort of good documentation? This is REST API documentation from the Spotify API. So this is about streaming music. I've not actually used this stuff, but I'm reliably informed that this is good API documentation. It's clearly written, it's well structured, it has the explanations you need to have. There's actually a lot of good examples of documentation out there. And API documentation is interesting because this is the public API, this is the public documentation. Because I don't care how badly their code is documented internally because I don't work on their team. So the code that we share with other people is something to focus on. One particular interesting thing about this documentation is that if you click down and you look at details of an album, as in a collection of songs, you find this explanation of the data. This is a very old-fashioned kind of documentation called a data dictionary. And what this does, which is extremely useful, is that it says what things mean. You know, the names might be good. You read the code and you say, okay, I see such and such, I see these fields. But you might not be sure exactly what they mean by this field. And so this kind of documentation is irreplaceable. You can't guess this very easily. This is domain knowledge. So this is sometimes useful kind of documentation to write. And this is just one sentence at a time. We're not talking about writing pages of text. It's often easier to write this very structured documentation because you don't have to feel like you're writing an essay. People always ask about tools for generating API documentation, but they solve a different problem. So tools like Swagger are useful, but they generate the structure, they generate the layout, they give you a way to publish and read the documentation, but they don't actually generate any of the words. And if you generate it without the words, then it's not very useful. But writing the words is not so much effort. So use API docs generation tools, but don't forget that there is still a writing task in there. Team chat turns out to be extremely useful. It's extremely popular and has been for a very long time. Team chat is a very good way to prevent people from coming and interrupting you while you're writing code, because that's not something you want. Some people resort to using headphones so you don't get interrupted, and train their colleagues to ask them questions on team chat. You can argue about whether that's healthy or not, and perhaps as programmers we should talk to each other a bit more, but let's not judge. Let's just take advantage of the fact that all of that team chat transcript is a kind of documentation, provided that you can find it. And so an excellent justification for choosing team chat with good text search, paying for Slack, if that's what you're using, is that you can search the transcript, going back years, potentially. Because then you may answer questions by remembering that it's been asked before and just finding the answer. This is much more efficient than writing documentation. And it doesn't really feel like writing documentation. It just feels like socializing on the team chat. And there are various alternatives. I mean, these are only, IRC, Slack, HipChat, and Gitter are the only ones I've used in the last few years. But there are lots of others. Use one and try and figure out how you can use it to substitute for documentation. And look for search, look for text search. We have some other cool tools for publishing and writing documentation. But the tools for documents, bigger documents, multiple pages, are not great. It's all a bit old-fashioned. I mean, to be fair, it's probably more than 10 years since I gave up word processors because we have wikis. But wikis haven't really done anything. Wiki software hasn't evolved much. And so, maybe we're ready for some new kind of software that's going to replace wikis to make writing a page of documentation easier. But maybe for now, this just means that actually that kind of documentation is just going away and we focus on the other kinds of things. So maybe it's interesting to look for new kinds of documentation. For example, this code example I showed earlier introduced a couple of exception types in the kitten example. But we never seem to use lolcats to document code. I mean, this works, right? You can have pictures. This is a missing kitten. This is not actually a kitten. This will make the code much more interesting. Here's another kind of documentation I found that is the heading up there is the prologue light bulb joke. And what you can't read on the first line because it's tiny, it says something like, the purpose of this tutorial is to teach you enough prologue so that you can understand the prologue light bulb joke. I mean, this is a brilliant motivation for a tutorial so that you can just understand the definitive joke. And so this is the whole tutorial, and it's quite long. I mean, it takes a bit of time to read it. I mean, the short version is essentially that, you know, in prologue, you build up these long expressions, and then you get an answer from the interpreter. And eventually, you might end up with some big amount of code like this over there. And if you get it wrong, the interpreter's not very nice. And so, just for the sake of completeness, does anybody here know the answer to this one? Know any prologue? Well, prologue just says false if you get it wrong. Every programming language has a joke, but that's another talk. Okay, so to wrap up, last 5 minutes, I've got some practical tips that you can apply that should help you write less documentation, and if you have to write documentation, hate it a little bit less. So I've mentioned them before. Write an introduction, probably a README for your software, and maybe you just leave it at that. Just write the introduction, and the rest people can find in the code. But you get people started. And explain why, explain what it's for, explain why this stuff exists. If you want to add more detailed documentation, you may find that it's really worth writing detailed installation instructions so that you don't waste your whole first day with a bit of software trying to figure out how to install it. Detailed installation instructions, step-by-step instructions that tell you exactly what to do. And then publish everything online. Use open source software, publish your solutions to problems with the open source software, because then you can be famous as well as feeling smug because you've actually documented your software. And write comments. I mean, try it out. You know, the writing comments might not cause the end of civilization. It might turn out to work out okay. The way to write good comments is to treat them as part of the code, to not have different rules to the code. So the way you do it is that you write one sentence. You write just one sentence. Start with one sentence per class, maybe go to one sentence per method. And then realize, okay, now can I refactor the code to make this unnecessary? Refactor the code, then refactor the comment. And if possible, delete the comment. But don't skip the step where you refactor the code. Because people often say, well, if I refactored the code, I wouldn't need the comment. To which the answer is, well, you didn't refactor the code yet, did you? The code is still incomprehensible and therefore needs the comment. So write the comment or refactor the code. In fact, better, write the comment, then refactor the code, and if you finish doing that, then you can delete the comment again. Rewrite comments in the same way that you rewrite code. And remember, this is all about not having to go to meetings to explain stuff. So comments are not as bad as it gets. I mean, comments are in a way the least bad documentation. So detailed installation instructions where you say, click this, type this command on the command line, seems quite laborious to write, but doesn't actually take that long. It's very long-winded. It's like writing Java code, but it's very useful for the person reading it because they don't have to get stuck and go in the wrong direction and keep asking you questions. So this is a kind of documentation that is maybe worth adding. Documentation is writing, and the most important advice in writing is remember who your audience is. Know who this is for, and know what it's for. And don't write documentation without a good reason. And so if you think there should be documentation, you don't have a good reason yet. You need to have a better reason to actually go to this effort of stepping away from the coding. The reason is a person. A person needs the documentation. If you can't identify the person, don't write the documentation. Mostly, though, the person is just yourself in 6 months' time. It's a sort of breakthrough moment the first time you search for something on Stack Overflow. You find the answer to your question, and then you realize that the answer was written by you a year ago. That's the best win you can have in documentation. Then you know, okay, I'm glad I did this. So I've said it before, and I'll say it again because it's important, because documentation is not like code. Write as little as possible. Don't write none, because that's really doing it the hard way, but don't write very much. And then only if you're not finished yet, only if things still need explaining, do you write more. And the reason you write more depends on the system. So in every computer system, there's probably some complexity somewhere, but it depends what kind of system it is. And so some systems have complex business processes, some have complex data models. In some, the complexity is somewhere else. So just find the complexity that needs explaining and find the documentation type that solves that problem. But mostly, you don't need any of these. And actually, I think you basically never need UML. Does anybody seriously use UML? I mean, and I'm not counting just putting a box and an arrow on the whiteboard. Yeah, nobody, right? So choose the right kind of documentation and look for examples of documentation that solves the problem in a modern way and looks like it might have been easy to prepare, or at least fun to prepare. And I highly recommend presenting. That's fun. Use simple technologies. I mean, things like XSL formatting objects seemed like a really good idea at the time, but it's just horrendously complex. And it solves a much bigger problem than one we actually have. And so the fact that Markdown is sort of, you can't do much with it, that's the whole point. It's great because it's so simple. Another thing that's not very popular in documentation, I don't really know why, is there aren't enough jokes in documentation. That's always a problem. Why shouldn't there be jokes? I mean, it's boring stuff at the best of times. It turns out you can figure out how to make things funny. So do that. So use the humor, choose your favorite tool, and write a small amount of documentation. And as a parting note, I'm going to save you years of your life by suggesting don't write a book, because I tried that, which was sort of fun, but it took a couple of years, and I'm not getting that time back. You don't have time to write a book. It's like the waterfall development of documentation. It's the old-fashioned way of doing it. I mean, it was a very rewarding experience, and I learned a lot about technical writing, but I wouldn't do it again. Release early, release often. So, wrap up. None of us like writing documentation, but we have to do it. So you need documentation, but you don't need very much. This is important. And we have this notion that nobody likes writing documentation, but that's not really true. And so as long as we keep perpetuating this myth, we're coders, therefore we don't write, we sort of put pressure on the people who would actually quite like writing. Try it out. You might like it. If you like it, if you're a coder who likes writing documentation, although that might seem really weird to a lot of people, and sometimes I feel like I'm the only programmer in the world who likes writing documentation, it turns out to be very useful as a skill combination. So not all developers hate it. And best of all, you might just find somebody else to write it for you, which is the ultimate documentation avoidance. Thank you very much.
Do you have any questions too? Okay, already one.
Hi, thank you, nice talk. I want some comments on a related problem. Even if there is some documentation, some developers don't read it. Stack Overflow programming is the extreme end. How can we solve this?
If programmers aren't reading the documentation, it might not be their fault. So you shouldn't have to make anybody read the documentation. It should just save them time. So maybe you shouldn't have to. If you only have documentation people don't read, you should probably throw it away. It's kind of harsh. I mean, maybe you don't want to hear this, but, you know. But another way to get people to actually use documentation is to push back on their laziness. So sometimes people don't use documentation because it's easier to just come over to your desk and ask you questions without even looking it up on Stack Overflow. But maybe they don't realize they're stopping you working. So just say it's on the wiki. Make them go away and look for it. So push back. Just don't give them an easier option. At least don't give them an option that wastes other people's time. Because that's the benefit of documentation particularly, is that people can answer their questions without interrupting you. So consider whether the documentation is good enough. And if you think it is, then don't answer the questions verbally.
Thank you.
Next one.
Thanks for the great talk, Peter. Okay, now can you give us an extra tip on how to maintain documentation, how to keep it up to date?
Yeah.
A lot of times we have documentation, but after a while, it doesn't make any sense because everything changed and no one got back to update the documents.
Okay, so document maintenance is hard in the same way that code maintenance is hard. And if it's been too long and it hasn't been maintained, then just like code, you're just going to have to throw it away. So step one is to actually do the maintenance. So don't abandon the documentation. Maintain it as much as you maintain the code. You just have to do this. So realization, get past the denial about maintaining documentation. Rewrite stuff, improve it, try and remove stuff. Do the same things you want to do in code. Look for documentation you can delete because it's no longer necessary. Try to make things clearer like you do in code. So maybe a key way to do this is to every time you change the code, consider what documentation you should be changing or deleting. You can use code review as the moment. You can use checklists. Doc saw it didn't happen is a good catchphrase. You say you've implemented this feature, but where's the documentation update? So just maintain it. Very easy to say and hard to do.
Yeah,
so
right.
I sympathize. But yeah, you just have to actually maintain it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.